You may recall from our previous discussions the profound tragedy that struck the French army at the battles of the frontiers in August 1914. Their vibrant uniforms, featuring blue coats and red trousers, made them easy targets for German machine guns as they advanced in large formations across open fields. This resulted in an unprecedented loss of 27,000 French soldiers in a single day, the highest single-day casualty count for any country throughout the entire war. The French army was ready for war, but they were woefully unprepared for the nature of modern 20th century combat. At the war's outset, France had a system of universal conscription, with men entering service at 18 for a 4-year term. After this, they would serve in the reserves and later in the territorial army, a commitment that spanned much of their adult lives. The uniforms, equipment, and tactics of 1914 had barely evolved since the Franco-Prussian War. Infantry soldiers wore a kepi cap, blue greatcoat, and the infamous red trousers. Their leather personal equipment was notably cumbersome compared to other European armies. The standard 8mm Lebel rifle was exceptionally long, and with a bayonet fixed, it was taller than the average soldier. The typical infantry unit was the Régiment d'Infanterie, or RI, with 1,073 regiments in existence at the start of the war. Each RI had about 70 officers and 3,400 other ranks, organized into 3 battalions. The severe deficiencies of the French uniform became painfully clear in the first few months of the war. Consequently, in early 1915, the Army introduced horizon blue uniforms. In the trenches, they adopted British-style puttees in October 1914 to adapt to trench warfare. A steel skull cap was briefly issued in March 1915 to be worn under the kepi, but this was quickly replaced by the Adrian M1915 steel helmet. France was the first to widely adopt steel helmets, manufacturing over 3 million by December 1915. The practical Adrian helmet remained in use for the duration of the war and was also adopted by the Belgian, Russian, Serbian, and Italian armies. The horizon blue uniform also proved effective, though a mustard-colored khaki was later introduced for colonial troops. Let's take a closer look at some specifics. The 1884 model kepi was made of bright red wool with a dark blue band and leather visor. It featured a red regimental patch and had 2 air vents. Many soldiers continued to use these caps into 1915, often with a blue cotton couvre kepi cover. The various belts included the 1873 Le Centurion with a brass buckle and the 1905 model, which required suspenders. In the popular imagination, the German soldier of World War I is often defined by the distinctive spiked helmet, but their uniforms involved much more than that. The German army was established after the unification of Germany in 1871 under Prussian command, and following the defeat of the German Empire, was disbanded in 1919. The term Deutsches Heer referred to the combined ground and air forces and is still used for the modern German army. According to the 1871 Constitution, all male citizens were liable for military service between the ages of 17 and 45. However, mandatory service didn't begin until age 20, and the Army's selective nature meant many men were passed over or deferred, only to be placed in the reserves by age 22. In 1914, Germany was able to mobilize approximately 4.9 million men from a population of 67 million. While there was a huge influx of volunteers at the beginning of the war, this number dropped significantly after 1915, with only about 5% of eligible men volunteering. The uniforms worn by the infantry from 1871 to 1914 were a logistical nightmare. In line with military tradition, different regiments wore distinct colors for easy identification on the battlefield. Furthermore, until 1910, each German state had its own unique uniform colors, belt buckles, and insignia. However, in 1910, the entire army standardized on a Feldgrau or field gray uniform, though pre-1910 uniforms were kept for ceremonial use. The famous Pickelhaube, a leather helmet with a spike, was not a true piece of combat headgear. Before the war, its canvas cover featured a regimental number in bright red. This color was changed to dark green in 1914 and then removed entirely in 1915. A shortage of leather for the Pickelhaube, caused by the British naval blockade, led to the use of felt, fiberboard, and tin as substitutes. These helmets were expensive, fragile, and provided little protection, making them ill-suited for trench warfare. They were phased out in favor of the M1916 Stahlhelm steel helmet in the spring of 1916. Designed by Professor Friedrich Schwerd, the Stahlhelm featured 8mm horns on the sides for ventilation and to support a heavy armored faceplate called a Sternpanzer. There was also a sectional chest armor, known as lobster armor, which weighed 16 kilos or 35 pounds, but was often discarded by soldiers due to its weight and limited effectiveness in the trenches. Tunic designs were simplified over time. The cuffs of the 1910 design were simplified into a transitional style with turn-back cuffs, which were useful for storing small papers. All three tunic types, the 1910, transitional, and 1915, remained in production until the end of the war. The 1915 wool tunic, for instance, had concealed horn buttons instead of brass, with only 4 visible zinc buttons on the shoulders and pockets. The enlisted man's field cap, the visorless Feldmütze, and the similar NCO version with a visor were made of field gray wool with colored bands indicating the branch of service. The caps also featured 2 buttons with the national and state colors. In 1915, a new order from the Kaiser required all leather gear, including boots and belts, to be painted black to match the new uniforms. By 1917, due to persistent leather shortages, ankle boots and puttees became common. This was a brief look at just one type of German uniform. To understand the full scope, I encourage you to research this topic further. To emphasize that there's nothing romantic or cool about this war, I'll share an excerpt from a letter by Corporal Karl Fritz from the trenches at Verdun. For 3 days, we were in the shell holes, seeing death in the eyes, every moment expecting it. Besides, not a drop of water and the horrible stench of corpses. One shell burying the dead, the other pulls him out again. If you want to dig in, you get straight to the dead. I had a group, but every man has prayed for himself. The worst part is relief, the in and out, the constant barrage. All is full of wounded here and heavy smell of dead. Furthermore, it is also constantly under fire. We had about 40 people dead and wounded. This was little for a company, so I have heard. They all looked pale and consumed. I will not tell you more misery. It may be enough. Sincere greetings and kisses, and Godspeed by your thankful son and brother, Karl. During World War I, the British Army's uniforms underwent a significant transformation from their traditional scarlet coats to the practical khaki field dress. The final use of the red coats in battle was at the Battle of Guinness in 1885, after which khaki, which had been used in India since the 1850s, became the standard field color. By 1914, the British uniform was one of the most practical of all the warring nations, offering better concealment than the French and German uniforms. The standard uniform consisted of the 1905 pattern service cap, the 1902 tunic with 4 large pockets, and 1902 trousers.
Soldiers wore brown leather ammunition boots with hobnailed soles, and their lower legs were wrapped in khaki cloth puttees for support. As the war progressed, the uniform was simplified, and the most significant change in headgear was the introduction of the Brodie helmet in 1915, a steel helmet designed to protect against shrapnel. Approximately 8 million of these helmets were produced by the end of the war.
Officers' uniforms were different as they were privately purchased and tailored. They had an open-collar tunic worn with a shirt and tie, and their rank insignia was on their cuffs. They also carried the 1897 pattern officer's sword and a revolver, which were worn with a Sam Browne belt.
However, the swords were phased out by 1916 because they made officers easy targets for enemy snipers. Due to the high death toll among officers, a uniform grant of £50 was provided to help poorer soldiers commissioned from the ranks to purchase their uniforms.
The British Army also adapted its uniforms for different climates. For hot weather, soldiers wore a lighter cotton khaki drill uniform, and in places like Gallipoli or Palestine, they might wear just their gray undershirts. The cork Wolseley helmet was also common in these climates.
The first winter of the war saw the Army issue goatskins, greatcoats, and fleece jackets to combat the cold of the Western Front. Leather jerkins were also popular for warmth and freedom of movement. While there were variations for colonial units from Canada, Australia, India, and New Zealand, this summary provides a general overview of the standard British Army uniforms of the war.
Russian uniforms during World War I were a varied and complex system due to the country's logistical challenges and vast military size. While there were over 1,000 distinct regimental units with their own unique dress, the frontovik, or frontline soldier, or a simple, standardized uniform that was adopted in 1905.
For daily use, soldiers wore a farashka, a peaked cap made of khaki-colored wool or cotton. For winter, they used a tall fleece cap called a papaka, which had flaps that could be folded down over the ears. For very cold weather, they also wore a cone-shaped bashlik cap. Helmets were rare, though some elite troops received the French Adrian helmet.
The most common garment was the gymnastiorka blouse, a 1912 version that was typically greenish khaki but came in many shades due to inconsistent dyes. These blouses had shoulder boards that varied by unit and rank.
Soldiers wore khaki pants that were loose at the hips and tucked into their most prized possession, sapogi, high-top black leather boots. However, leather shortages later in the war led to the use of ankle boots and puttees. Instead of socks, soldiers wrapped strips of cloth around their feet. A heavy brown or grayish overcoat, called a chanel, was worn in winter. A leather belt with a brass buckle held 2 ammunition pouches. Other gear included canteens, a shovel that doubled as a frying pan, a bread bag, a mess kit, and a gas mask. The bayonet for the Model 1891 rifle was typically fixed to the weapon and not carried in a scabbard. The sheer size of the Imperial Russian Army with 15 million soldiers made outfitting them a monumental task. The country's lack of resources, poor infrastructure, and a corrupt bureaucracy compounded these challenges. As a result, the uniforms varied widely, and shortages, especially of leather, were common later in the war. Russian soldiers endured some of the harshest conditions of the war, including extreme climates, which tested the durability and practicality of their gear.
Romania joined the Entente in August 1916. The standard uniform was the Model 1912, a green-gray woolen uniform with a high collar and arrow tabs, unique to the Romanian Army. The pants were also green-gray, except for cavalry and artillery, who wore black pants.
In winter, a greatcoat was worn, while a lighter cotton tunic was used in the summer. Infantry soldiers wore brown hobnailed ankle boots, while officers and cavalry wore tall black leather boots. Uniquely, their puttees were worn inside their boots.
The standard headgear was the capella, a cloth cap influenced by both French and German designs. Officers wore French-style kepis, and some border guards even wore German spiked Pickelhaubes, which were later phased out. The Romanian army did not have steel helmets until 1917, when they adopted the French Adrian helmet. A simpler model 1916 uniform in a medium gray color was adopted just before Romania's entry into the war out of necessity, as its former ally, Austro-Hungary, was now an enemy.
The soldiers' equipment was standard for the era. It included a leather belt with a spade, bayonet, and 2 large cartridge pouches. Other gear was carried in a canvas bread bag and a backpack. Their mess tins were identical to the Austro-Hungarian Model 1899.
Romanians faced a shortage of modern weapons. Their infantry was equipped with the Mannlicher M93 bolt-action rifle, which was manufactured for them in Austria-Hungary. Since they couldn't get new rifles once they entered the war, they had to rely on their existing stock of approximately 330,000 modern rifles, which was not enough.
As a result, second-line troops were issued the outdated 1879 Puszka Martini Henry, a single-shot black powder weapon. They also had a limited number of pistols and machine guns, the latter being the 6.5mm 1909 model Maxim machine gun.
The Austro-Hungarian Empire was a multicultural powerhouse with 15 different language versions of its national anthem. This diversity was reflected in the uniforms of its soldiers, which, while having a basic standard, featured regional and traditional variations. The core uniform and equipment for an Austro-Hungarian infantryman in 1914 were the result of a modernization program from 1907 to 1908.
The initial uniform color was a heavy gray wool called Hechtgrau. This color was later replaced in August 1915 with a more neutral Feldgrau, field gray, for better concealment on the battlefield. Uniforms varied depending on a regiment's origin, such as the Polish look of the Uhlan cavalry or the German uniform worn by Slovene regiments.
Unique headgear included the Maciejówka hat for Polish legions and the fez for Bosnian infantry. For the average soldier, the standard head covering was the Feldkappe, a wool field cap with a visor. These offered little protection and were largely replaced by 1917 with the German-inspired M17 Stahlhelm steel helmet. The Bosnian regiments were notable for wearing a fez, which was red-brown for parades and gray for field service.
Soldiers' tunics were initially heavy and featured an uncomfortable standing collar, which was later replaced by a more practical stand-and-fall collar with external pockets. A stiff concealed collar was worn underneath to prevent chafing. On the collars were brightly colored tabs used for regimental identification, but this system was often confusing, with 10 different shades of red used in 1914 alone.
Trousers varied by nationality. Austrian infantry wore straight-cut, ankle-length pants with gaiters, while Hungarian infantry wore tight-fitting breeches with a distinctive braided knot called a vitus cortis. Standard footwear consisted of heavy, hobnailed leather boots. The soldiers' basic equipment included a leather belt with 2 ammunition pouches, each holding 2 5-round clips. A leather field pack, the tornister, was used to carry personal items. However, due to the immense economic strain of the war, these leather items were replaced with cheaper canvas and cloth alternatives from 1915 onward, including a canvas rucksack. Rank was displayed with stars and lace on a collar patch or the tunic itself.
As materials became scarce during the war, the silver and gold stars of officers and the white celluloid stars of NCOs were replaced with metal or cloth versions. The original metallic thread lace was also swapped for silk. This system allowed for a wide range of specific insignia to differentiate between junior, senior, and general officers. Serbian military uniforms during World War I were a mix of old and new, reflecting the nation's limited resources and foreign influences. Following its independence from the Ottoman Empire, Serbia sought to modernize its army, initially drawing inspiration from Russia. This led to the 1896 uniform, a dark blue design with a shikacha cap, which was still widely used by second-line troops in World War I due to a chronic lack of modern uniforms. Officers' uniforms were more intricate, with the 1900 pattern introducing the mundir, a double-breasted tunic. The standard field uniform for the majority of the Army was the 1908 olive green pattern, a practical and simple design. This uniform featured an olive green wool tunic with 4 pockets and hidden buttons, along with matching trousers and a greatcoat. Headgear was also an olive green shikacha cap, designed with a flap that could be folded down for cold weather. Due to chronic shortages, infantry soldiers, who were mostly peasants, were often issued with opanci, traditional leather peasant shoes, because they were cheap and familiar.
Serbian soldiers' equipment included a belt with large ammo pouches, a water bottle, and an entrenching tool. Most soldiers carried a simple bread bag instead of a backpack. Following the army's devastating retreat through Albania, the remnants of the Serbian forces were re-equipped by the French. The reconstituted army wore French uniforms, including the Adrian helmet with the Serbian crest. Officers, however, often maintained their old 1908 uniforms or had new ones made, creating a visual distinction from their men. The text notes that Serbia's limited resources meant that its third-line soldiers, aged 18 to 21 and 38 to 50, were often poorly equipped, sometimes only receiving a greatcoat and a cap, or even just wearing civilian clothes. This vulnerability gave Austro-Hungarian troops a pretext to treat them as guerrillas.
We are in Dixmude, Belgium, at a museum inside the Isertoren, exploring the evolution of the Belgian Army's uniforms during World War I. At the war's outset, the Belgian Army's attire was a blend of different uniforms, lacking a single, cohesive style or color. This collection of different uniforms, worn by grenadiers, carabineers, and civic guards, was what the soldiers wore during the Battle of the Iser in October 1914. After months of continuous retreat from the German border, the Belgian army was in desperate need of supplies. This scarcity forced them to source uniforms and materials from around the globe, including France, Argentina, the United States, and England. This resulted in a conglomeration of different uniforms, where a Belgian soldier might be mistaken for a French one due to the mix of foreign-looking clothing.
Over the course of the war, the uniforms evolved. They transitioned from their initial varied colors toward a more standardized khaki. The caps were replaced by a helmet, specifically the French-designed Adrian helmet, which was adopted by the Belgians and worn with a camouflage cover. The Army also developed specialized tactical units from 1916 onwards. These small, elite groups used equipment like rifle grenades and were active in the flooded areas between the Belgian and German lines, often conducting raids to capture prisoners. The logistical challenges of the war also extended to footwear. The Army faced a chronic shoe shortage, leading to a global search for manufacturers. Additionally, an ophthalmologist named Vickers designed a specialized helmet to protect soldiers from eye injuries, a testament to the innovative needs of trench warfare. By the end of the war, the Belgian Army had moved away from its initial hodgepodge of uniforms to a fully standardized khaki uniform, equipped with more modern gear like Mills equipment, which was used during the liberation offensives. This transformation from a mixture of everything to a recognizable, uniform force marked a significant change in the Belgian army's visual identity and combat readiness.
In the era of the First World War, the attire of Ottoman soldiers reflected a period of military modernization, heavily influenced by European powers, particularly Germany.
This shift became visible after the Young Turk Revolution of 1908. By 1909, the old dark blue uniforms were replaced with a basic khaki uniform, although the earlier blue versions were still worn by officers for formal occasions. A major change was the replacement of the red fez, or tarbuya, which had been worn for a century, with the khaki kabalak cap. This was later succeeded by the simpler bashlik, a long khaki cloth strip wound around the head like a soft helmet. Soldiers of Arab descent often wore their traditional kufiya headcloths instead.
Later in the war, some Ottoman naval caps were designed without a front peak to accommodate Islamic prayer customs. Branch of service was indicated by colored collars for officers and color patches for other ranks. For example, infantry used olive green, artillery used dark blue, and the air service adopted red in 1915. Rank was shown by pips and braiding on shoulder boards or stripes on sleeves.
The quality of uniforms and supplies for the Ottoman army varied dramatically. While many officers had their gear custom-made in Germany, most enlisted men's equipment was produced in Turkey, and its quality deteriorated significantly as the war progressed. By 1917, boots were in such short supply that even some officers lacked decent footwear. On one occasion at Gallipoli, soldiers received a bizarre mix of donated clothing, including high-fashion underwear. The personal equipment and weapons, such as the Turkish Mauser rifles and carbines, were predominantly of German design and manufacture. However, as the war wore on and reserves were called up, the army faced severe shortages of arms and entrenching tools. In one extreme case, a unit of 8,000 men was reported to have only 1,000 rifles, with the remaining soldiers presumably going into battle with little to no armament. Ottoman soldiers were unique in the sheer variety of fronts they fought on, which spanned from the deserts of the Middle East to the frozen mountains of the Caucasus. Their uniforms and equipment had to adapt to these wildly different climates, demonstrating a level of flexibility that was not seen in most other major armies. This adaptability, combined with the resourcefulness and resilience of the soldiers, was a testament to their will to fight despite being poorly equipped.